In 2009, Canada handed General Motors $10.8 billion to save its auto industry. Within weeks, an internal GM memo classified Oshawa, once the largest car plant in the British Commonwealth, 23,000 workers at its peak, as non-core. No one in government was told. Canadians kept buying GM vehicles. They just weren't built here anymore. To understand how Canada lost its car empire, you have to go back to the very deal that built it. General Motors arrived in Oshawa in 1918, taking over a modest Chevrolet plant on the edge of a carriage-making town. The deal was simple but ambitious. GM acquired the site, betting that Canada's growing appetite for automobiles could support a full-scale assembly operation. That first year, the workforce numbered just over 1,000. Within a decade, the plant's output stretched beyond Canada's borders, supplying the Chevrolet Export Series to markets across the British Commonwealth. The hum of engines and the clang of presses soon became the soundtrack of Oshawa. By the late 1930s, the factory's red brick walls enclosed an industrial ecosystem, assembly lines, stamping shops, and a growing network of suppliers feeding parts and materials into the heart of the operation. The plant didn't just build cars, it built the town around it. Tax revenue from GM funded new schools, hospitals, and paved streets. Local businesses thrived on the steady paychecks of line workers, mechanics, and tool and die specialists. Families moved to Oshawa for the promise of steady work and a shot at the middle class. The Second World War transformed the factory almost overnight. GM retooled its lines to turn out military vehicles and equipment, employing more women and immigrants than ever before. By 1945, the payroll had swelled to 12,000, a figure that seemed unimaginable just a generation earlier. The end of the war brought a surge in demand for new cars, and the plant shifted back to civilian production without missing a beat. Rows of brand-new Chevrolets rolled out onto the shipping docks, destined for towns and cities across Canada. For many workers, a job at GM was more than a wage. John MacDonald, who started as an apprentice in 1953, remembered the sense of pride that came with watching a finished car glide off the line. A job at the plant meant security, a mortgage, a family vacation, a future. The factory's success was woven into every corner of Oshawa's daily life, from the Union Hall to the corner diner. By the end of the 1940s, General Motors had become the town's anchor, its fortunes rising and falling with every shift change and production run. As the post-war years unfolded, the plant stood as a symbol of Canadian industrial strength and optimism. The scale of operations hinted at even greater heights to come, a baseline of prosperity that would define Oshawa for decades and set the stage for the challenges that would follow. By 1964, the Oshawa plant reached a scale few could have imagined at its founding. More than 23,000 workers clocked in every week, making it the largest private employer in the country and a pillar of the local economy. That year alone, the factory turned out over 500,000 vehicles, Chevrolets, Pontiacs, Buicks, feeding an insatiable post-war demand that stretched from Vancouver to St. John's. The town's rhythm was set by the shift whistle, its prosperity measured in steady paychecks and new model launches. The following autumn, a new era arrived with the signing of the Canada-US Auto Pact on October 7, 1965. Heralded as a breakthrough, the agreement swept away tariffs on cars and parts moving across the border. For Oshawa, it promised two things: access to the world's largest automotive market and the chance to operate at a scale that could rival Detroit. The Pact's 50% Canadian value-added rule meant that as long as half the content of each vehicle was built in Canada, through parts, labor, or assembly, the cars could flow south without penalty. In return, American-built vehicles would enter Canada just as freely. The result was a surge in production and a sense of security that seemed unshakable. But embedded in the fine print was a risk few fully grasped. The very clauses that fueled the boom also tethered Oshawa's fate to the economic weather south of the border. When U.S. demand surged, the factory ran overtime. When it slumped, layoffs followed almost instantly. The plant's fortunes now rose and fell with every American recession, every Detroit boardroom decision. The Auto Pact's promise of scale came with a new kind of vulnerability, one that would only grow sharper in the decades ahead. Inside the factory, the collective voice of the workforce echoed both pride and unease. Union leaders celebrated the new jobs, but some warned that the plant's future was now tied to forces beyond Oshawa's control. For workers on the line, the numbers told the story. 23,000 jobs at the peak, a record 550,000 vehicles in a single year, and a town transformed by the hum of mass production. Yet beneath the surface, the seeds of exposure had already been sown, setting the stage for the shocks and reckonings that would come with the next downturn. The first cracks in Oshawa's confidence appeared not on the factory floor, but at the gas pumps. In October 1973, the world's oil exporters imposed an embargo that sent prices soaring overnight. The cost of a barrel of crude quadrupled in a matter of months. By the time the second oil shock hit in 1979, the price spike was even sharper, with gasoline rationing and long lines stretching down Canadian streets. For a plant built on the promise of big, V8-powered sedans, these global tremors were more than a distant headline. They were a direct threat to the jobs and lives of thousands. Inside the Oshawa complex, the mood shifted from pride to anxiety. Production schedules were slashed as American consumers abandoned full-size cars for smaller, fuel-efficient imports. The assembly lines slowed, then stopped. In the span of a few years, more than 2,000 workers received layoff notices. Paychecks that once supported mortgages and family vacations disappeared, replaced by uncertainty and a growing sense of betrayal. Stagflation set in, wages stagnated while the cost of living climbed. For the first time since the war, workers faced the prospect of permanent job loss, not just a temporary layoff. The Union Hall, once a place for celebrations and contract victories, became a gathering point for anxious meetings and hard questions. Older workers worried about lost pensions. Younger employees wondered if they had a future in the only industry they'd ever known. The impact rippled through Oshawa's main streets. Local diners lost their lunchtime crowds. Suppliers, from parts makers to uniform laundries, cut shifts or closed doors altogether. The city's sense of security, built on the steady rhythm of GM's payroll, began to erode. For the first time, it was clear that global events could reach into the heart of a Canadian factory town and upend lives overnight. The oil crises did not just dent Oshawa's output, they exposed how tightly the plant's fate was bound to forces far beyond its control. Toyota's arrival in Cambridge, Ontario, in 1988, delivered a shock that rippled through Oshawa's union halls and boardrooms. The Japanese automaker's new plant, built just an hour's drive from GM's sprawling complex, was profitable from its first full year of operation. Toyota's success rested on a different cost equation: lower average wages, leaner work rules, and a relentless focus on efficiency. By the late 1990s, the wage numbers told a stark story. While Oshawa's line workers earned around CAD $35 an hour with benefits, their counterparts at Toyota made less, and GM's own plants in Mexico paid just USD $8. The arithmetic was unavoidable. Each vehicle rolling out of Oshawa carried a labor cost nearly CAD $2,800 higher than the same car built in Mexico. Union leaders like Linda Thompson sounded the alarm. She warned that a gap of this size made Oshawa vulnerable, not just to foreign rivals but to decisions made in Detroit's executive suites. The numbers appeared in every round of bargaining, every internal GM analysis. For the company, the cost gap wasn't abstract. It showed up in spreadsheets comparing per-vehicle profitability, in memos weighing the future of each North American plant. By the early 2000s, these calculations drove a new corporate logic. Shift production to lower-cost sites, concentrate high-margin models where labor was cheapest, and treat legacy plants like Oshawa as expendable when the numbers didn't add up. Inside the plant, workers watched as more production shifted south. Trucks and SUVs, once Oshawa's bread and butter, were increasingly built in Silao, Mexico, or in right-to-work states in the US. The union's leverage, once built on the promise of a closed market and a steady stream of high-wage jobs, weakened with every new round of global competition. Toyota's Cambridge operation, meanwhile, expanded, its flexible workforce and lower wage bill proving irresistible to analysts and executives alike. By the end of the 2000s, the cost arithmetic was inescapable. GM's own internal reviews listed Oshawa's labor costs as a primary reason for its non-core designation in 2009. The wage gap, once a point of pride for Canadian auto workers, had become the factory's greatest liability. For Oshawa, the threat was no longer just the next economic downturn, but a relentless global competition where every dollar counted and every job could be moved with the stroke of a pen. In 2001, the North American auto market faced a sharp downturn. For Oshawa, the numbers left little room for sentiment. Management announced a 15% cut in production capacity, a decision that would ripple through every corner of the sprawling complex. The body shop, once a hive of activity, was shuttered, and a full assembly line went silent. The closure meant hundreds of jobs lost in a single stroke, but the calculus behind it was cold and precise. Labor and overhead costs had climbed while profit margins thinned, and the plant's configuration no longer matched the realities of a globalized market. Executives in Detroit and Toronto weighed every option before making the call. Internal spreadsheets compared per-vehicle costs across GM's North American plants. Oshawa's labor and benefit expenses stood out, especially against newer facilities in Mexico and the southern United States. The body shop, with its aging equipment and higher maintenance bills, became the first casualty. Union representatives pushed back, arguing for retraining and investment, but the company's direction was clear: cut fixed costs, concentrate production elsewhere, and keep only the most profitable lines running. For the workers, the shutdown of the body shop was more than a technical adjustment. It was a signal that the plant's future was no longer secure. The loss of a single line meant fewer shifts, fewer paychecks, and a sense that Oshawa's place in GM's global strategy was slipping. Suppliers felt the blow as well, with orders drying up and delivery routes rerouted to other plants. This downsizing was not an isolated event. It reflected a broader pattern across the industry, as automakers responded to recession and relentless cost pressure by trimming capacity and shedding older assets. Oshawa's first major cut in 2001 foreshadowed deeper changes ahead, with the plant's configuration now dictated by spreadsheets and quarterly forecasts rather than tradition or local loyalty. The ground was shifting, and the logic of consolidation was beginning to take hold. When the global financial crisis threatened to topple General Motors in 2008, the Canadian and Ontario governments stepped in with an unprecedented rescue. Together, they committed $10.8 billion in public funds, an amount that dwarfed any previous industrial bailout in the country's history. The move was sold as a lifeline for thousands of jobs, a safeguard for communities like Oshawa that had built their identity around the factory gates. Cabinet ministers spoke of partnership and long-term security, assuring the public that the investment would protect Canada's stake in auto manufacturing. But the paperwork told a different story. The main loan agreements and asset purchases, drafted behind closed doors, left out any legally binding guarantee for jobs or productions on Canadian soil. Instead, the language in confidential side letters referred only to the maintenance of strategic employment, a phrase so vague it offered little real protection. There were no hard numbers, no minimum headcounts, and no penalties if GM shifted future production out of Oshawa or closed lines altogether. Elaine Mack, a policy analyst who reviewed the agreements, later described the bailout as a public wager made on trust rather than contract. Parliamentary transcripts from 2009 show opposition MPs pressing the government for details, asking whether any clause could actually prevent GM from cutting jobs or shuttering plants. The answers were evasive. Officials pointed to market-driven decisions and the need for corporate flexibility, sidestepping demands for enforceable commitments. For workers and local leaders, the gap between public rhetoric and contractual reality became painfully clear in the years that followed. The billions flowed, but the jobs were never truly secured. The rescue that was supposed to anchor Oshawa's future instead left it exposed, dependent on promises that, when tested, proved as fragile as the economy itself. On February 14, 2009, a confidential memo circulated inside General Motors headquarters. Authored by Craig Johnson, Vice President of North American Operations, its language was clinical, but the implications were anything but routine. Oshawa, once the flagship of GM's Canadian presence, was now classified as non-core. The memo's financial model was blunt. With a projected operating margin of -2.3%, the plant fell short of the company's new profitability threshold. The document spelled out a 30% workforce reduction plan, effective immediately, and froze all new capital investment. The Global Restructuring Committee gathered on March 22 to review the recommendation. Board minutes from that day record a rare moment of dissent. One strategist warned, "The social contract with Oshawa's community could create reputational risk if the closure proceeds without a mitigation plan." Still, the majority agreed, and the numbers left little room for sentiment. The memo's annex listed alternative scenarios: retooling, joint ventures, and government incentives, but each was dismissed as insufficient to close the cost gap. For Linda Thompson, president of the Canadian Auto Workers Ontario Division, the news landed with the force of a verdict. She described the non-core designation as a decision made in a closed boardroom, but felt first on the shop floor, a signal that the plant's future was no longer in Canadian hands. The fate of Oshawa and the community built around it was sealed not by a single event, but by the arithmetic of a spreadsheet and the signatures on a memo few would ever see. The migration of GM's most profitable trucks out of Oshawa began quietly after 2009. Over the next 8 years, production of models like the Silverado and Sierra shifted to Silao, Mexico, drawn by labor costs a fraction of those in Ontario. By 2017, the last full-size truck rolled out of Oshawa's line, and the plant was left assembling lower-margin vehicles. The numbers told the story. Every truck moved south meant fewer shifts, fewer supplier contracts, and a growing sense of finality on the shop floor. In November 2018, GM confirmed what many had feared. The company announced there would be no new product allocation for Oshawa beyond the following year. The closure would erase 1,500 direct jobs and trigger an estimated 650 million Canadian dollars annual fiscal hit for the city, lost taxes, shuttered businesses, and a blow to public services that had once depended on the plant's steady revenue. Layoff notices arrived before Christmas. For workers like John McDonald, now retired, the sight of the empty lot where the assembly line once roared was a stark reminder of promises broken by decisions made far away. Then, in April 2022, the gates reopened, only partially. GM invested in a new truck line, rehiring 1,700 workers, just a fraction of the plant's historic peak. Nearly half the repetitive tasks were now handled by robots, with 45% automation woven into daily operations. Productivity rose to 1.2 vehicles per worker per hour, but the hum of machinery replaced the old chorus of voices. The reopened plant stood as a symbol of adaptation, not revival. Oshawa's story had become a case study in how global cost arithmetic and corporate strategy could strip a community of its industrial core, even as Canadians continued to buy the very vehicles now built elsewhere. Today, Canada's share of North American vehicle production stands below 10%, even as Canadians keep buying the same brands, just built far from Oshawa. The industrial logic that once fueled entire communities now bends to global cost calculations and shifting trade rules. What vanished in Oshawa is not just jobs, but the illusion that prosperity is guaranteed. The next reckoning may come faster than anyone expects. Share your thoughts below.